Welcome all. Good morning and good afternoon to you all. And today we are going to take a deep dive into workflows with SharePoint Online specifically. The presenters, okay, so just as a quick intro, my name is Gayatri. Most people call me Guy, and I head technology in Marga. And I started off my career with IBM with a lot of focus on IBM notes and workflows and different collaboration products. And over the years, I've actually switched over to many technologies. And over the last few years, it's been a lot about Microsoft and collaboration and workflows with Microsoft technologies. So I'll be presenting part of this webinar. And Gopi, would you like to just do a quick intro of yourself?
Yeah, sure, Gayatri. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. This is Gopi, and I have been working as a SharePoint architect for the past 2.5 years. I have over 13 years of IT experience, and predominantly for the past 6 to 7 years, I have been working on SharePoint product. And that is all from me, and thanks. Hey, Gayatri, you can take over.
So just as a quick reminder, we are over the next few months creating almost a world of workflow champions. We found that it's important in many organizations to have people who understand what workflows are and how best to design them and create them and how to kind of work with them. So if you would connect us on LinkedIn to Marga Systems. We have a community that's being created, and we can share information and post relevant topics, especially around workflows into that. So would really encourage everyone to connect with us on LinkedIn. So without much ado, like a very quick intro to Marga. We are a boutique consultancy with enterprise customers across the US and Europe. A lot of focus on workflow and collaboration as well as digital transformation. A lot of focus on Office 365, especially on the SharePoint Online and Office 365, much more than the on-premise version. Of course, we have been working with on-premise in the past as well, and Java and .NET as well. Okay, so Scott, if you can run the poll 1. The idea is to kind of get an understanding of the audience to see what you use SharePoint for, and especially if you use SharePoint Online. So that will give me a sense of where you come from. So Scott, could you just run the quick first poll?
Okay, the first poll is live for everyone to put in your vote there. So what do you use SharePoint Online mostly for? Is it for custom workflow and web applications, enterprise content and document management, internet and social network, team sites, or not using SharePoint Online yet? All right, so we have over 80% of us have already voted. This is good. Everyone's very friendly with their mouse. That's great. Okay, I'm going to share the results. So I think we got 2 more votes coming in. Yep, there they go. All right, so I'm going to share the results. So we have 17% of the audience says they're using it for custom workflow and web applications, 14% for enterprise content and document management, 8% for internet and social networking, 17% for team sites, and 44% of us are not yet using SharePoint Online.
Okay. That's interesting. Good. So today we are going to talk a lot about workflow applications and primarily on online because there are certain things that are very relevant in that arena. So we focus on how this workflow applications should be built, what are some of the key areas to and features that you should focus on, and some best practices and things like that. Hopefully you will all find that useful. Okay, how many of you have seen this situation, right? I mean, IT manager gets an email, right, from one of the business owners. Like, for example, this is probably the the payments people. It's a very simple email that comes, and I get it quite some time too. Heard that SharePoint can automate this. Please, someone will fill a form, send it to a treasury, and I want workflows to be enabled for workflow approvals. And then once it's all set up, then finance will just update a payment information, and I want some requests. And I've also heard that SharePoint can do this very quickly. Can I have this next week? So this is very common, especially in organizations that are new to SharePoint, as well as who are learning that SharePoint can do things very quickly. Pretty familiar. And what might happen is if you assign it to a newbie, the person would go in and understand just the requirements, start building up the application. Yes, it can be done fairly quickly, but then it goes through so many iterations, and after it gets rolled out, and then Mark, the person who requests for new changes and says, you know what, I want this additional approval, you know what, I think they should be able to add this additional field, and then changes after changes, and then Mark is like, I'm not very happy about it, I'm having to change too many things. Whereas, if you were a workflow champion, you have a defined process. You have a checklist for tracking workflows. What kind of requirements should go in? Do I have all the requirements? Check if really SharePoint is suitable, because sometimes it's not, and we'll talk about when it is and when it is not. And use some of the best practices so that you don't hit the wall after deployment, but you can plan it out pretty well ahead of time. Make sure that things can be automated as much as possible, and then your Mark can go wow about it. So today's entire webinar, to a fair extent, is about walk towards becoming Amy, the workflow champion. That's what we're going to try and do as much as possible today. What is the process that a champion does? First of all, gather the requirements, and when we talk about workflows and workflow applications, there are a few things that you should gather upfront, because these kind of requirements and these kind of information make sure that you can design the architecture and the tools and the additional functionality that you want to provide upfront, rather than tacking it on at the end of the application after you have built it. When you're building the application itself, there are best practices, especially when you come to SharePoint Online. We will talk about some of the best practices that have been recommended, as well as some traps that you shouldn't really fall into and then kind of have issues with later. And also look at some wow factor, again, that obviously will depend upon time and budget and things like that, but there are a few things that you can plan for ahead of time, because of which overall your users are pretty well satisfied. Let's start very first with the requirements gathering and validating against the workflow checklist. Number one, especially when you have workflows coming from, requests coming from, it's multi-department or sometimes they are even multi-country, goes from, gets raised in a region and then gets approved by global and things like that, is to first of all understand if this overall process has an owner. And can you describe the entire process, what this is trying to do, in a few sentences? For example, let's take a travel. Travel request, you can say, finalize the travel itinerary within 15% of the lowest fare, with all the budget approvals done from the client side, and after supervisor approval within the limits of the organization policy. Something like that, right? It kind of captures very specifically what your final destination is. And would you be able to draw out the process? Actually, if you take a paper and a pencil, would you be able to say, if this happens, then that should happen, and if this is the state of the workflow, then I should be able to do A, B, C, D, E, and after this particular action has happened, so and so should do this. Would you be able to draw this out without having confusion? And also, do we have metrics that kind of measure the success of this workflow? So I'm going to show you a checklist that we have put together. Let me switch over. And you don't have to take notes, and you would be sent some of this, which has 5 dimensions and a lot of checklists, lots of questions that can be answered. And the more number of these that you answer while you're gathering your requirements, it'll be much easier for you to develop something that's going to be in line with what the customers needed. Sometimes you won't get answers, but that's okay. You could also answer them using some standard best practices that are available. So this is available. This can be sent across to you. And let's switch over. Yeah. So once you have the checklist ready, then you have a fairly good idea of the overall requirements. And once you have the requirements, that's when you start to decide on your architecture. Gopi, we have always seen that there are times you get requirements which are not suitable for SharePoint, and even if they are suitable for SharePoint Online, how do we actually build it has questions. Would you like to throw some light on specifics on this, how you've seen this?
Yeah. Sorry, hey, this is Gopi. Yes, sure, Gayatri. So basically, before we even dive into see, if SharePoint Online would be a suitable solution for us, and also when it comes to designing or architecturing the entire the process, workflow definitely is one of the factor which gets affected if the data is not, if the design is not right. Before we see, we just have to make few I'm sorry, we just have to make few decisions where to see if the workflow involves any complex business logic to get into an approval state, and if there are any systems participating in the workflow process. Typically, we see this in insurance LOBs, and when it involves large volumes of transaction data per day. So this basically would be several thousands of items per day. So when these scenarios come into picture, we just have to make sure, if SharePoint Online is going to be a suitable suitable platform to have this. And even within the SharePoint Online, there are many ways to build, like how we store the list, how we store the data in the list versus the data which is stored in Azure cloud as SQL, and if there is a need for any workflow engines. So these are the few things which will definitely have to be addressed with respect to the workflow scenario, Gayatri. And
So we also look at the web jobs, right? Because especially with SharePoint Online, if you want to run some of the jobs, I want to go and update some things automatically and things like that. In case of SharePoint Online, we may have to choose Azure, right?
Yes, Gayatri, that's a very good question. Yes, I mean, we do have to rely on web jobs as in SharePoint Online. Say if it involves any background jobs which have to be run, like many background processes, we won't be having the access as it is more SaaS based. And one of the other alternative is hosting a web job in Azure and trying to run our web jobs from Azure cloud environment. And as the more number of jobs it gets, it is definitely a costlier solution.
Right, right. Okay. So, Scott, can you just run poll 2? I would like to understand what kind of business units really request for workflow applications in the organization.
Okay, here comes poll 2. So pick the top 3, so it's multiple select here. Pick top business units requesting workflow applications in your organization. So again, pick 3 of these 5 answers. So it's either coming from sales and marketing, HR, finance and procurement, administration, or IT and customer service. All right, so we're already over 70% voting, over 80%. Everybody's alive still. That's great. Thank you for your feedback on this poll. And all right, I'm going to share the results. So, somewhat evenly divided. Sales and marketing at 25%, HR at 56%, finance and procurement at 50%, administration at 53%, IT and customer service at 67%.
That's pretty interesting, and it's very similar to what we have seen as well. Usually we get a lot of requests for workflows primarily from HR and finance and also customer service. So some of these are also changing with respect to SaaS platforms and things like that. But thanks for that response. So let's look at some of the typical components. If I have to look at a workflow application and that you have to build on SharePoint Online, there are a few components that have to be thought about and discussed and architected right. By no means it's an exhaustive list, but more often than not, all these come together with respect to a user interface, which is what we say a form, a vehicle that goes through the entire workflow process, the data store and the document libraries and the lists, which are actually storing some of this metadata and the data itself, the actual workflow, the different steps, the tasks, the notifications, and how the vehicle goes through the entire process, what kind of views and reports that are needed for the different stakeholders to play a part and also see how things are happening within the application. What are the access permissions? I mean, obviously, in most cases, we see that there's a long list of accesses that are do's and don'ts, who should be able to see what, do what in the overall scheme of things. And one of the key things that we also notice is the workflow applications rarely stay out of touch with the core enterprise system. It could be SAP, sometimes it's Oracle. They usually integrate. The workflow and the results happen in SharePoint, and finally either the data is fed into something like an SAP, or sometimes you pull the data from SAP and run the workflow in SharePoint, and these are typical components that we have seen. So in today's webinar, again, because of the paucity of time, we're going to focus a little bit more on the user interface and designing the lists and the libraries, and a lot more on the actual workflow engines and how do you define workflows. So that's what we will do, and all of this in pertinence with the SharePoint Online platform. So Gopi, the key thing is also, once you have a requirement, is to define the entire library, the list and things like that. Can you touch upon why we do that and how we go about doing that?
Sure, Gayatri. So basically, in order to have a perfect and a better system, it is always good to architect our classification of all the documents or lists at the taxonomy level. So once we build the taxonomy is nothing but managed metadata. Say a document belongs to finance, and if we want the workflow process to go efficiently and smoothly, this managed metadata would obviously help us for smooth approvals. So I would definitely look how the classification of all these documents which exist would be existing, and also by defining the lists and document libraries, I would definitely make sure they don't reach the threshold limit where obviously the performance gets an hit. And also I would also definitely look at how long would we require this items or documents to be available in the live system before archiving. All these factors would definitely make a huge influence on how efficiently we can build the workflows, Gayatri.
Right. And I think it's also important to look at setting up some of the archiving process, because you can actually pull data from archives for your reports, but more the data that lives in a current system or a live system. I mean, I'll take an example. If you have a travel request, obviously, once it's approved and probably the travel dates are done, you can archive that. It's only needed for reports, whereas the actual live system has only those requests that are current, which are either not yet approved or not yet completed, and which makes the overall system a lot more responsive in terms of the views will be shorter and things like that, and you won't hit some of the limits that you could end up hitting if you don't plan this step pretty well. So the next step, obviously, once you have defined the actual design of the backend, which is the list, the document libraries, where are you going to store the attachments? I mean, for example, this is the requirement we saw very clearly said, hey Dave, I would like to make sure that people upload documents. Anytime someone is uploading a document, they are kind of attachments. They are kind of extraneous documents that have to be stored. And in SharePoint, for example, if you have such documents, if you put them well tagged in your document library, then your search can find them much better. So as Gopi specifically said, your taxonomy makes a difference. How do you tag them? And sometimes, especially when you come to a workflow system, your form or the user interface could be defined in such a way that your metadata is stored, and whereas your actual attachments are going into a document library. These are kind of things that you should plan and do so that overall the system becomes a lot more easy to use and also is user friendly. So coming to the user interface or the vehicle, right, like what we call the form that is actually going through, or the document that's going through the entire workflow process, I feel the first thing that it should do is to pass the simplicity test. And what we mean by that is, I mean, imagine any of you, did someone have to train you to use the Amazon app? No, right? I mean, and it's fairly complex. It's not, it's got multiple steps. It's got ability to search. It's got ability to actually buy and put in your credit card. Yet no one actually had to teach you to use it. So one of the things that you might want to do is to think about, if an absolute newbie employee of your organization were to be given this form, can he fill it out without any issues and use the system without training? It's a good test to see how simple your application is. Second is to embed the instructions. I mean, there used to be a time, probably a few years back, where you would submit a form, and then after that it would kind of come and tell you, you know what, you haven't filled in this information properly, or it would come and say, I was expecting the telephone number in this particular way. But today's web forms and today's mobile applications are much different. The instructions are embedded, examples are right there, just helping the users to kind of seamlessly use this particular vehicle, this particular form through the process. And three, yes, today it is mobile first. We will see, the fact that SharePoint Online gives you capability, which is making all your forms by default responsive. But even if you're building custom functionality, custom UI, you should make sure that they are available on mobile. Of course, it adds a little bit of complexity. You have to think through this, but it makes a world of a difference because that's the way the entire organizations are going. It's a good idea to track the workflow. I mean, yes, they can go to a workflow task page, kind of see where the workflow is going and things like that. But if you can, and if you have the real estate for it, inside your form, inside that, when someone is just opening up their request or the starting point, if they could see the different steps that are going to be there in the workflow and highlight where this request is, it becomes very easy for users to know where they are. They don't have to really look at the status. They don't have to really look at, an audit trail or an approval trail to see what really has happened. It's very easy for them to visually see where they are in the overall process. And finally, especially when you are talking about SharePoint, less is more. So sometimes you may be encountering applications, and let's take an example. We just recently did something where it's primarily an evaluation system. Now, in an evaluation system, the the existing sheet in Excel is very well defined, and today people are very used to doing it. Now, there is no reason why you will have to completely redefine or recreate the entire sheet in SharePoint one more time as a list and things like that. You could templatize the Excel sheet, make that the data capture, add metadata, and run the workflow around the document itself. So sometimes, yeah, you could use a Word document or an Excel sheet as your data capture mechanism, but run the entire workflow around the metadata for this particular document, and you could still, like, deliver a solution that's very specific to the needs of your user. Gopi, I would like to specifically hear also about some of the mechanisms in SharePoint Online for building these user interfaces, and especially if you can talk a little bit more about the SharePoint framework and the JavaScript libraries and things like that.
Yes, sure, Gayatri. As we are seeing, like there is a lot of transition which is happening from the SharePoint Online perspective, where earlier in the earlier versions there was an ability to run scripts on the page, and slowly, as that would be more detrimental for the entire site. Slowly, the ability to run scripts through web parts like content editor web parts and script editor web parts have been deprecated with the modern UI. So the client-side web parts are more built against the SharePoint framework, where it pretty much limits the ability of the end user to pretty much configure, rather than getting into the web part and manipulating the script. And all the web parts which are built against the SharePoint framework are responsive. So any device, and they are targeted for any device. So it is single line of code. It is basically a single line of code which works for all the devices, and firstly these are mobile friendly, and also basically what the info path which was generally used to customize the elements to enter new data is now being obsolete. These are the few things which I have noticed while building the client-side web parts using SharePoint framework.
Right, and also, like, I think even the default SharePoint UI has become quite a bit responsive. So it's kind of for example, for your admin screens or something like that, you could go with some of the default user interfaces that SharePoint Online provides by itself, because even those are responsive and they are pretty easy to use. So it kind of reduces the overall effort required to build and workflow application. As Gopi pointed out, clearly, like, the way to go forward is with SharePoint framework, and the advantage is you can use it with standardized JavaScript libraries. Today, like, you could use AngularJS or you could use React. React is the preferred JavaScript library for Microsoft, and or Knockout. So you could build a very rich user interface, a fairly robust user interface, and more importantly, you can also reuse some of the functionality that is available across open source. For example, if I want to add a mapping capability, or if I wanted to add a capability for calling out from a mobile device and things like that, these are available as components, and suddenly you have the ability to use quite a few of these things also when you're building your SharePoint application. So that's also interesting to note from a user interface perspective. So once the user interface is decided, you also have to see how are you going to connect your user interface with your backend. And what we also see is REST is becoming pretty much the standard. One thing with SharePoint Online is for people who have probably used SharePoint on-premise servers and have been able to work with, server-side scripts, you have been able to provide fairly rich functionality from the backend perspective. When you come to a SharePoint Online, it's a tenant and it's shared. So obviously they're not going to let you go ahead and release scripts that are going to be detrimental across the site and things like that. So the preferred mode is to use REST API as a standard, and you can use the client-side object model only if your REST is not suitable, or sometimes the functionality doesn't work exactly as expected. So we have given you a couple of links. Please do go through them. Microsoft has done a fairly good job of documenting all the different API calls which can be used from a SharePoint perspective. The idea is which is different from how it used to be earlier, is the tight integration between the front end and the back end. Today, like you can have with SharePoint framework a fairly separated out front end, which kind of integrates with the back end using standardized REST calls, which kind of also makes it a standards-based application, very similar to how you would build robust enterprise applications. So, stepping down into the specifics of workflows. Gopi, I know we have several ways of building workflows inside SharePoint Online. So let's go through some of their best practices, pros and cons of these, and walk people through how do you build workflows inside a SharePoint Online application.
Sure, Gayatri. So as of now, basically, we basically have workloads, two kinds of workloads which are configured in SharePoint Online, which are the SharePoint 2010 workflows, and we also have SharePoint 2013 workflows. The only difference is these get executed against different workflow engines, and the latest workflow engine what we have right now is the workflow 4, and the most prominent feature of the new workflows which run against the 4 framework is they live outside the Office 365 and SharePoint environment, and these are basically configured in Microsoft Azure. And both these workflows are available to be created from the SharePoint Designer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and yes, Gayatri, and there are some built-in workflows which already exist within the SharePoint Designer, and these workflows can be used for the different business cases we run through. For example, the workflows, the built-in workflows which already exist are the approval workflow, where it basically, you can approve a document or an item, and it can be sent for a group, and by default, it is pretty straightforward. After configuring, you can basically have additional steps on how you want to handle the document approval process. And later on, we do have collect feedback, and this workflow basically it routes a document or an item to a group of people for feedback about the document, and reviewers can provide the feedback, which is then compiled and sent to the person who has initiated the workflow. And we do also have the collect signature workflow. It is basically you can route it to a group of people to collect their digital signatures, and these are all inbuilt workflows, and they definitely help in streamlining the process, where it certainly reduces the manual intervention. And apart from this, I'm pretty sure like there will be certain scenarios where the inbuilt workflows won't help us. So for this specific reason, we can also build custom workflows using SharePoint Designer, and also the latest and also the latest version. What I basically see is it is integrated with Visual 2013. To have a more visual representation of how the workflow flows by using the connectors and branches. So these are few things where these are few things where I find workflows are more robust than what they are before. Where now in the latest workflow 2013, you can call external web services from within the workflow. And also you have different ways of handling a workflow through loops and stages, and some of the information can be found on the slide where a URL is shared, Gayatri.
Right. So I think one of the things that was different also is before 2010, if you wanted things like loops or if you wanted multi-stage workflows, you necessarily had to go in for a product like say an Nintex or a K2, a third-party product, which had a lot of these functionality and they had a lot of connectivity and default workflow templates. So it made your life a lot easier. But I think with SharePoint Online, one of the differences, I'm not saying like, everything can be done with SharePoint Designer and the default mechanisms of workflows, but the need for something like a Nintex has come down a little bit because of the functionality that Microsoft itself has added. But definitely when you want to have the same workflow engine act on multiple products, multiple systems, then it makes sense to look at third-party workflow engines. But if your workflows are kind of very specific only inside SharePoint Online, working with data that's only inside SharePoint Online and well contained, then especially for custom workflows, it makes sense to just go with SharePoint Designer at this point in time. But the key thing is there is a new opportunity or the new thing that has come out called Microsoft Flow. And I know, definitely there's a lot of buzz in the community looking at what can Flow do, what is Microsoft intending to do, because quite a bit people were looking at saying, hey, is this going to replace SharePoint Designer? Is this going to be the new workflow engine for Microsoft? What is going to really happen? One of the things that we are seeing at this point in time is, yes, over the period of time, possibly this would be the way Microsoft is going towards. But as of today, we see that Microsoft Flow is more a personal workflow engine, if you could call it that, because it's a lot about it's almost like a self-service workflow. Let me take an example. I'm a sales guy. And anytime I have an email coming from my customer or my representative in a customer organization, and I would like to put it in a particular group, I would like to put it in a particular, tag it in a particular way, or I would like to take that information and post it onto a list. Now it's all around the person, right? And it's a lot about if then what model. So if this particular thing happens, do this. And the key difference is Flow can connect to other products. Like I could say if there is a mention of heck in Twitter, take the tweet and post it into my into a particular group, or post it inside, take the tweet and save it as a PDF into my OneDrive, things like that. There are many different ways of engaging with Flow, but it is a separate product. So it's not an included product. It has its own licensing model, more almost like a pay-per-use model, right? You have a free, which is like 750 Flow runs per month, and several paid plans going all the way up to enterprise grade plans where you can run say 50,000 flows per month and things like that. So there are different models available. As of today, we still see it could change over the next 6 months as things progress step by step. But as of today, we still see that Flow is more a personal use kind of a product compared to SharePoint Designer workflows and things like that, which are more enterprise use. The other thing also is people make flows and publish them. So you could publish a flow that someone else could download and use, and these are all, like, fairly new, and different models are emerging, how organizations are like taking advantage of it. We are looking from Marga's perspective, really we are not yet using Flow for enterprise workflows yet, primarily because of the entire licensing models that are coming into play, and B, we would like to see the robustness, especially when you are attaching flows to very large volume workflow situations. So we are still waiting and watching. We are not yet using them for enterprise grade workflow situations. Okay, so let's get specifics also into the implementation of workflows. We have seen a little bit about the different tools to build workflows with. Just to leave you all with a single thought, as of now, if you have a kind of a framework, right? How do you make choices? If you have workflows that are going to interact with multiple systems, we will have to also act on multiple systems. You should consider third-party workflow engines, as well as you should look at really whether SharePoint Online is a good model. If you have also a mix of hybrid, like I have some systems which are on-premise, some of them are on cloud, some of them are SaaS-based. Can it do it? Yes. But is it the right solution? Should be analyzed. For pure SharePoint Online-based workflow systems, like some of your HR systems, you do all the workflow activities and finally just post data into your ERPs or your PeopleSoft or your SAP or any of those. Yes, it's a good model, and you could pretty much do a lot of functionality with the set of built-in workflows or SharePoint Designer workflows, which are by default available in SharePoint. And of course, there are multiple models of how to build them as well. So some of the key components or some of the key features that any workflow application must have, right? I would definitely think audit trails is a big feature, right? It's very important at any point in time to be able to pick out where and what has happened to this particular work product. It could be a form, it could be a document. I would need to know who has approved it, who has not, when did they do it. So audit trails are very important. A view or a visual workflow tracker makes the life a lot easier. Ability to approve by some mobile devices, and today that's going to be I would say 100% of the use cases. Even if your customers don't mention it at all, you should bring this as part and parcel of your application, because somewhere it's become implicit. People are not explicitly asking for it, but it's become fairly implicit. There are two other things which are not so commonly asked from a customer perspective. They won't come and tell you this, but you should include it as part of your architecture. Again, it's part of the workflow checklist. The things about cleanup jobs. You may end up having workflows that are stuck. You may end up having workflows. The person moved, and there are a set of tasks that are pending on his plate. How do you make sure that they move to a different person, a delegatee, or you just want to clean them up and replace them with newer tasks or newer situations? Having those set of scripts and backend code that is available to do some of these cleanup activities in a seamless manner. And most importantly, configurability. You need to have master lists and data, for example, creating groups for access control, creating groups for notifications, and being able to manage it in a specific way. Because otherwise, if you have things hard-coded inside your application, the key challenge that's going to be is when change comes, and change is a constant. Okay, So let's run a poll 3 to see if people are still engaged. Where are you in your workflow journey with SharePoint Online? Scott, if you can run poll 3.
Okay, we have our third and final poll. Where are you in your workflow journey with SharePoint Online? So this is a one selection. So have you moved to Office 365 for email and exploring SharePoint Online? Actively using SharePoint Online for workflows? Have workflows but need to migrate them to SharePoint Online? And or are you still doing workflows with other tools? So we have over 70% of us have already voted. I'll give us about 3 more seconds and then I will share the results. Okay, so 39% of us have moved to Office 365 and exploring SharePoint Online. 3% are actively using SharePoint Online for workflows. 36% have workflows, but we still need to build them on SharePoint Online. And 21% are using other workflow design tools.
Great. Super. So some of the best practices that we talk about in the next few slides and also some of the issues that you could face are probably the starting point, especially if you're going to be building workflows with SharePoint Online. Let's start off with some of them. There are more, but we just picked some of the top ones to discuss. We did talk about the need for audit trails. And another important thing from a workflow perspective as a developer is for you to know where are these tasks. And as Gopi said, in SharePoint, especially with SharePoint Online, workflows is not a integrated thing, right? It is running on its own engine on Azure. So collecting this information and logging it into a history list is going to be very useful and very important, because that's when you can debug what's happening. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult overall to find out what's happening with your application, where are things and where it's stuck. So there is something called log to history list, which is something that you can use to collect more information. One of the things that we've seen is to capture this workflow status separately, right? Instead of just capturing it, there is a default field available inside SharePoint, but by capturing it in a text field separately, now there are 2 things that can happen. One, if you have a fairly large workflow, you may want to split it up into smaller tasks, smaller workflow tasks, and so there are clear start stops. And because there are clear start stops, even if one of those stages is going to fail, you could restart it and things like that. And importantly, if you have such a text field, what happens is you can start using them in filters, and typically we find that the users love them because they could go in and say, okay, just show me all my workflows that I have to act on, which are all have been completed and I don't want to touch them anymore. Things like that. You could create nice filters which allow them to just focus on the work that people need to do. Notifications. Now, obviously, workflows, notifications are a very, very key part, especially when someone has to act on a task or when they have to be reminded about it. Now, if you start sending things to individual users, the problem is if there is going to be a change in the user. Now, when you associate them with groups, it becomes a lot easier to manage. And one key thing is when SharePoint Online and you connect it with the AD groups, then overall maintainability of these workflow systems becomes a lot more easier, and also it saves a lot of trouble for the developers. The other thing is the important part is also when you're using workflows inside SharePoint Online, now you could associate workflows with specific lists, which is what is holding data, or a document library in this case. But you could also associate workflows at an entire site level. Now, what happens is when you do something like a site or a site selection level, you can associate the same workflow with multiple forms or multiple work products. So let's take an example of a HR workflow. Let's say whether it's your leave or whether it's your travel request or whether it's an overtime allowance or whether it's a simple time off because you're going off-site. Any of these, let's assume you have a standardized workflow that your supervisor has to approve it. If your supervisor is not available, then it has to be approved by the department manager and the information gets translated and given to a HR. Let's assume this is your workflow, and then several of these, though the forms are going to be different, the workflow is the same. Then if you kind of create it the right way, then you wouldn't have to recreate the workflow every time. You could create just a form which captures the appropriate metadata and run the same workflow for all these. So that kind of advantages start coming up when you think through the overall design of your workflow application. Another thing, and we will talk about reports and analytics just a little while, capturing this data. When did something get approved? When did something get rejected? And every aspect of it, when you start logging it and when you capture the data, what happens is you could overall analyze the effectiveness of the process itself. Things like, 80% of this particular process gets done within the SLA. Now, how do you first of all, you need to be able to set an SLA, and then unless you capture the data, you can't really compare against an SLA to create meaningful metrics. So it is a best practice to kind of capture some of this data. There are several other best practices, but I think we are running out of time. We do have challenges to face. So we will, as I said, if you join us on the LinkedIn group, we will publish more of these best practices for you guys to take home and practice on. Let's talk a little bit about some of the traps and issues that you could potentially face if you don't design your application well. Gopi, would you like to talk a little bit more about this entire throttling issue? I know we've faced it, or we've seen customers having this issue.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, sure, Gayatri. So most of the times, what we basically see is if the list is not properly architectured, and we have an issue with throttling, which is about 5,000, where the performance gets affected, and none of the users can get to the list, and they cannot even get into view the items in a list. Like if we get to the threshold level of the throttling, the best idea is like you architecture your list in such a way that you won't reach the you don't reach the threshold limit. One way what we can suggest is based on the departments, maybe you can architect your list in a different way such that we don't get to that 5,000 limit, and that is one primary thing which very commonly happens if we don't architect the data properly in a list. And while yeah, Gayatri, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so the other thing also I think we've seen is when you have just along with the same list, when you have a lot of items and then each one goes through its own workflow. For example, I think Office 365 also has very specific limits in terms of how many times a specific workflow can run on a specific list item in a particular site collection in a particular time period. So it's not just one, right? It's not generic to say, okay, workflows. It's a limit set against a specific workflow on a specific list, on the number of items on a list within a site collection. So that is 5,000. So, and that's a 24-hour limit. So as Gopi said, if you don't architect your list properly and if you kind of start off workflows on every item on the list, now suddenly you could end up facing this problem where you say my Office 365 throttle it and say, I actually reached the limit of the number of requests you can make, the HTTP requests you can make. And then they will kind of say you cannot do it unless you restart some of these, and they have a time limit, and all these will start happening, which is a pain. So there are a couple of ways to do this. Like definitely, as we talked about right earlier, avoid complex algorithms, because I mean, if you have multiple steps in a workflow and then each one going through complex algorithms and then it starts off on a list and things like that, you could mess this up pretty easily. Infinite loops are a no-no, obviously. And the difference is, if you come from a SharePoint on-prem environment, there are certain ways to get around these kind of no-nos. There are, like, and especially older type SharePointers will know how to do these things, and they are used to doing it. With respect to SharePoint Online, it's a problem. And of course, you can always build it as an app. We did talk about hitting some of these limitations. Yes, there are some variable limits and there are some string functionality. So it is important to design it and architect it properly, so that overall the applications will function in the way that you want, and you don't hit some of these issues after deployment. Sometimes you don't test. I mean, in the interest of time, I'm not going into the testing part of it. But key thing, I'll just leave you with one thought, is when you're testing your application, kind of hit these limits and try them out, because sometimes it's after you roll it out and a lot of people jump on it, and I've seen this happen several times. People see the application, they like it so much, and they start using it very, very well, and then after that you start hitting some of these limits. So it's important for you to test it out at the edges, even as you are defining and developing these applications. Okay, so let's just do a quick feedback survey. I'm just going to pause for a minute before we open up for questions and things like that. So if you do fill the survey form, you get the workflow checklist sent across to you. It's a PDF file that you can use, and you can start using the checklist in your application. And for the first 10 requesters, if you have challenges in your workflows, you can come to us, and we will have a one-on-one consultation available with our experts, our SMEs. Scott, have you shared the link to the survey?
Yes. So if you open up your chat section of your GoToWebinar control panel, the link will be in the chat that I've just sent out to everyone. So you can actually click on that link, fill out that quick survey, and then you will get the checklist, the free checklist.
Super. So while people are doing that, I think we are running pretty much over time. So I'm just going to walk through a couple of things and then open up for at least a couple of questions. The last thing is to wow your users. Now start thinking about this. We don't have the time to go into it in detail, but when you're architecting your entire workflow, think about auto approvals, setting up specific limits. I mean, does this workflow step have to involve a manual click, or can you automate it based on certain conditions? Today, hardly people use emails. They are all used to push notifications. Can you send out push notifications so that people can act on your workflow much easier? There are nice tools that are available which make callouts, SMSs, and so all they have to do is see the message and then respond with a 1 or a 2 to say approve or reject. Could you do something like that to kind of go off your users and make things much easier for them? And overall, yes, social is important. Collect feedback as comments or likes or reactions, as opposed to having people to really click a button on different ways. So these are some of the ideas that you can keep in mind in order to take your workflow applications to the next level. So here's a quick reflect, and we open up for questions at this point in time. Scott, I think maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we can answer the rest of them later.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we actually do have a question lined up already. More along the lines of forms. So the question is, what about forms? Is InfoPath gone? And if so, what do you suggest as a replacement?
Okay, I'll take the question. So what happened is, InfoPath, if you have them on-premise and then you want to bring them over online through migration, will still work. But if you are if you are a company that's just looking at SharePoint Online, you're new to it, don't use InfoPath. It is not the best practice. So the alternative is, there are three things. Either if it's a very simple UI that you want, you could use the default SharePoint form builder itself. It's simple, but it is responsive. Doesn't give you too many options, but you could build it with them. If you want, you have the complete control building with HTML5, CSS. In fact, SharePoint has something called UI Fabric, which gives you a lot of components pre-built and complete set of JavaScript frameworks, right? You could use, say, React.js or AngularJS, use components from them, and then put together a UI which is very rich in its functionality and integrate with the backend where all the data is stored inside SharePoint. In fact, Microsoft at this point in time is recommending that methodology, saying, hey, use this thing called SharePoint framework because it allows you a lot of control over the user interface that you want.
Okay.
So,
Hey, hey Gayatri, I just like to add something. Like even apart from all of this, you just develop that particular form, and it is responsive on all the devices. Like I mean, it is responsive and it is very user friendly. So I believe building against the SharePoint framework would definitely be a huge plus.
Okay, brilliant. All right. Well, we really are over time. So if you have additional questions, I think, Gayatri, do you have a slide here to show how to contact you?
yes, I don't, I think. But yeah, I'm sorry about that. I forgot to add my email address. But you could send, let me shift over to the very first slide because both our email addresses are there. I'm going to shift over. I missed.
There
Yes,
we go.
so you have the two email addresses. Yes, you could contact either of us and we'd be happy to help you out.
Excellent. Great. An excellent, very informative webinar. There's a lot of content to cover, so I do appreciate you doing all of that. So again, thank you for preparing that. Thank you to everyone for attending. And Guy and Gopi, I'll give you the last word, and then we'll go ahead and close down the webinar.
So thanks everyone for attending. I hope you found this informative, and the key thing is to use SharePoint. It is a very powerful environment to build your workflow applications on, and there are best practices that you could use to make them very effective. That's what I would like to leave you with.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you everyone, and have a great day.